you set out to actually write a third book about healthcare in Canada. That was your starting point.
Yes.
And your publisher was a little quarrelsome with you about that.
So yeah, I pitched a book about empathy in healthcare, and my editor, Jim Gifford, said, it's a little narrow. And I think he sensed that there was going to be an expose about people who encounter unkindness in everyday encounters in healthcare. And some of them are banal, and if we thought about it, the people who work in hospitals, as I do, we'd be horrified. Things like the patient who spends 4 days in a corridor and has no privacy, and except for those times when they go to one of 2 bathrooms in the geographic area, or the way that sometimes we break bad news. And Jim Gifford said, no, why don't you go into the world? I guess he said, did he say, our marketing people want you to go out into the world? and that was a terrible thing for me. It was awful because, I know a lot about healthcare, and I thought I'd be drawing on my own experience, which is considerable, 35 years in the trenches, but that was all gone. Basically, I was going to be writing about empathy in the bar, empathy at a donut shop, empathy in a supermarket, kindness or lack of kindness at a call center, everyday experiences that you and I have, that we all have. And I began that search being very much at sea, and asking experts for interviews, and for a while I thought that neuroscientists who study empathy are the least empathetic people on the planet. No time, sorry, I'm writing a book, I don't want my book to compete with yours. And on the other hand, the Schadenfreude people loved me from the start, and they were very kind to me. And slowly but surely I started to kind of pick away at it, and then I found the thread, and I realized that the thread was me, and where I was in the midpoint of my life, and was I a kind person? And do I have a kind soul? That's almost the first question that I ask. Do you have a kind soul? And I think it's everybody's question, to ask ourselves, are we kind? Am I kind? Are you? And I had reason to doubt it.
Your book did take you to a donut shop in Scarborough, but it also took you to Japan, it took you to Brazil, it took you virtually to Syria, and you note early in the book that we are hardwired to experience empathy one person at a time.
Right.
And I don't know if you remember the film Shoah in the 1980s about the Holocaust. It was about 600 minutes long, 10 hours. And I remember watching it, and at the end of it, it had no effect. Just the numbers were so large, the stories were so overwhelming, it was desensitizing.
Yes.
And the Clouds Over Sidra movie, talk about that, because it's a unique way for people, I thought, to understand not all Syrian refugees and what they're experiencing, but what one little girl was experiencing.
That's right. So Clouds Over Sidra is the first VR film that was commissioned by the United Nations, and I got to interview the director, Gabo Aurora, and this is a VR day in the life of Sidra, who at the time was a 12-year-old girl living in a refugee camp in Jordan, not far from Syria. And we see her going through her day. I watched it in Toronto, part of a campaign, and it was intended to attract investors, to attract contributors, and to kind of spread the word. And you wear the glasses. It was a Samsung Galaxy with cardboard around it, so it's very, very low tech, not the Oculus Rift glasses that your teenage kids salivate over, and or grandchildren or nephews and nieces. And you put it on, and it's about an 8-minute film, and it's incredible. You are listen, you see Sidra in front of you, and she takes you through the day, and people are running past you, and the first scene in the day is breakfast in the tent, and then the next scene is you see Sidra in school, and Gabo Aurora, when when I interviewed him, he said they deliberately chose a fairly mundane day so that you would relate to her as you would to anybody else. And you're quite right. You don't relate to thousands of people, thousands of refugees. It's a catastrophe, but you relate to them one person at a time. And that's how our brains are hardwired. That's how you make an empathic connection. You don't make an empathic connection to 1,000 people. You make them to one person. And we saw the gym where the young men were working out. A lot of the young men didn't go to school. Sidra commented. She thought they were silly, that they weren't taking their classes. Why aren't they going to classes? We saw Sidra playing soccer at noon. And there was a moment at the end of the day when she sat down. We saw her sitting down with her family, her mother and her father, and she said, my mom still makes our favorite meal. She doesn't have the spices she used to have back home. And I started to cry. Because I started thinking about craft dinner, and I started thinking about my mom, comfort food, and suddenly we had a connection. And Gabo Aurora and his partner Chris Milk, who does VR videos of U2 and other famous bands, he has called virtual reality an empathy machine. Now, I'm not sure. It's a gimmick. Certainly, that film has attracted more than $1 billion in contributions. So as an act of kindness, it's fantastic. Now, an even more interesting experiment to me is something called embodying empathy. And this is an experiment taking place in Winnipeg with funding from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This is a virtual reality replica of an Indian residential school. And I had a tour of a mock-up, a very early version of it, and I walked up. I could hear the birds. I could see the leaves blowing. It was about midday when according to testimony, the children would have been arriving. And these are little boys and girls who were wrenched away from their families of origin. A terrible, catastrophic day. And you walk in and you see where they are. You walk upstairs and see the boarding area. And in the middle of all this, I had a flashback of the day that when I was 8 years old and I got the strap. I got corporal punishment for being disobedient with a teacher. And the amazing thing is that when I told the indigenous elder who is kind of watching over this project, his name is Theodore Fontaine. He spent 12 years at 2 Indian residential schools in Manitoba. He began to empathize with me. He asked me, do you know about that strap? And I described it to him, and he started to tell me the factories where they would cut the pieces of leather to make that strap. And I was amazed at how he, with all of his suffering, and he battled alcoholism and despair and depression and shame, that he would want to empathize with me. That's the purpose of embodying empathy, to establish empathic connections between Canadians who say they want to know about what happened at Indian residential schools and the people who were in those schools, and they're trying to establish an empathic bond between the two.
Do you think that the 24-hour news environment, just there's too much misery, and that too much misery is eroding our empathy, or what is it that's making us, even though we're hardwired towards empathy and compassion, what's making us harder?
So part of it, certainly we can be desensitized. There's no question, and it's not just the mainstream media. It's also social media, and on my Twitter feed, I'm constantly being barraged with things that I'm supposed to care about, and I have learned, as a lot of us have, to kind of sift through them quickly. And I don't think that's really caring about things that I read about. I think it's pretend caring. And I think it's symptomatic of a bigger problem than that desensitization, and I think it's speed. Fast pace. We aren't giving ourselves the time to be mindful. And I think that part of it is that it's the rush of news, a lot of information that we're receiving, but I think I think we're almost addicted to running from one thing to another. One of the things I've learned in the book is that when we're in this state of feeling as if we're running from one thing to another, there's a good chance that we've fallen behind. There's a good chance that we haven't done things as well. We haven't been as fastidious as we usually are. Maybe we haven't said the right thing. So our minds are casting back to the past, regretting, thinking, I could have done that better. Ooh, I hope that reply wasn't too harsh. I hope that reply was fulsome. I hope this and I hope that. And worrying about all the things that we have to do in the future. So we're living in the regretful past. We're living in the worried future. The one place where we're not living is now and here. And more than ever, we need to find ways to be mindful, to push away the pressures, push back and say, this is too much. I can't keep doing this. I have to stop now. I have to be kind to myself, but I also have to be mindful, because you cannot, if you do that, you will restore your ability to be kind and empathic to others. But if you don't, you won't, because if you live in that regretful past or that worried future, you're self-preoccupied. And if you're self-preoccupied, you can't possibly empathize with other people. That's probably the most important lesson I learned from the book.